Hello, this is Dr. Punit Mahendru, and I'm a psychologist here in California. And I want to address some concerns for emotional well-being among the Desi diaspora, that is the South Asians, here and in other places as well. Others may also find it useful, but I'm specifically addressing it to our Desi friends and family because very often they feel that their cultural context is not fully understood by psychologists and therapists. So, with that understanding of that culture, as well as the range of emotional concerns that come up, I want to speak to you today. Today, we're going to talk about domestic violence and domestic abuse. And this is not in lieu of getting help by anyone. This is not to be substituted for that. If there is a concern, definitely professional help should be sought. Some sharing in a safe environment should be encouraged. Talking to counselor, therapist, even physician, or calling any kind of crisis hotline or domestic violence hotline is also encouraged. I also want to especially address some of my friends and colleagues at the Hindu Community Institute, and hopefully they will find this additional information helpful. So we're talking today about domestic violence and domestic abuse. So let's start with defining what that means. So domestic violence, violence itself means using force, exercising force with the intent of injuring someone. So there is an intent to hurt someone physically or sexually. So that still does happen, but it used to happen far more frequently in the past. But ever since the past few decades, when laying hand on another person has been criminalized, it is happening less often. But because this kind of an overt physical striking against the partner is criminalized, other forms of violence and abuse seem to have erupted even more so. And I'm not saying that physical violence doesn't happen, it does, but other kind of aggression and abuse seem to be more prevalent. Now, aggression, so violence is, intent to physically injure someone. Or it may also be more of overt aggression, such as shouting, yelling, name calling, banging doors, stonewalling, throwing objects, breaking appliances, breaking the TV, pushing the fist in the wall, even creating holes in the wall. So some of that aggression. Now, of course, it can happen in both the partners, but if this is happening more in a situation where one person is more of the perpetrator, and the intent here is often to intimidate the other person, to coerce the other person, to sort of get the other person to be to submit. And this kind of an aggression and sort of non-physical violence is just as threatening and hurtful and intimidating, not only for the person towards whom it is addressed, but to others who may witness it, such as the children. And it is violence and it is aggression, and it needs to be looked at that, even if there is no overt injury to any particular person. Then we want to talk a little bit more about abuse, which is sort of a long-standing, not just a single incident, but a long-standing pattern where one person is trying to sort of manipulate and coerce another individual. Here, a lot of behaviors go on which are very hard to identify. It's very hard to know whether this really is emotional abuse or whether it is something to really, be concerned about, because a little bit may occur in otherwise, in a bilateral fashion. If everyone once in a while might get frustrated and say something negative or yell out once in a while. But when there is a sort of a pattern, a consistent pattern, a repeating pattern, when one person is more domineering and aggressive towards the other, or if one person is trying to do things that are causing injury to the person's self-esteem. So I say that when there is physical violence, the injury is to the body, to the physical body. But when there is emotional abuse, the injury is to the person's spirit, the very soul of the individual is hurt. So the very soul of the victim is hurt. Of course, one can argue that the soul of the perpetrator is also injured, but that's another matter. We are kind of going to stay very much in the here and now. So the breaking of the spirit of the other person, of the victim, then becomes the intent, and it can be a learned pattern from growing up, or it can be a strategy that is employed to keep the other person's spirit down. It can manifest as, having conversations where there is stonewalling, but a person, instead of, when they don't get their way, the perpetrator doesn't get the way, they just completely leave the scene and shut the door and go cold. And the other person is left wondering what's going on. And there is this feeling of fear aroused in the victim. Then the stonewalling can extend for a longer period of time, which is called the silent treatment. A time period when the victim is not being spoken to, all attention, affection, communication is being withheld by the perpetrator. It's a feeling of being invisible. The victim feels invisible, feels dismissed, feels devalued. And, conversation may happen with people around the victim, but not with the victim, that is by the perpetrator. So it's a really extreme form of invalidation in a way, because, your very identity is being dismissed over here. There can be, of course, there is name calling and there's body shaming. Sometimes if there is some concern and the individual is being exaggerated, and even if there isn't a concern, they kind of just trying to make the other person feel less about themselves. There can be, one of the things that I have noticed very often in my clients over the several decades that I've worked with Asian clients, Asian Indian clients, and Asian clients from Pakistan and Bangladesh, is that there is very often speaking poorly, in a degrading manner, not just about the spouse, but the spouse's family, trying to bring them down, trying to show them in poor light. And if there is even a fragment of truth. Everyone has pros and cons, but if there is even a fragment of truth in it, to sort of exaggerate it and stress it, and even make it a point, make it an issue in the relationship. So it's kind of done in such a sort of a subtle manner, and the intent is to isolate the person. I'm not saying it's a conscious intent always. Sometimes it may be at a conscious level, sometimes it can be at a subconscious level, but it is to isolate the victim from their family and their friends, find some fault with them, and in a subtle or not so subtle manner, encourage the victim from not making any contact or not making frequent contact with their family, and not spending enough time with their friends. So then the dependence on the perpetrator increases, and it makes the situation even worse, because there is no outlet for some of the tension that may be in the relationship. The role of the individual may get attacked, like, you're not a good enough father, or you're not a good enough provider, or you're not a good mother, and you don't do this right. There may be comparison with other people and a lot of put downs. So the self-esteem is getting eroded little by little, till the victim, no longer feels their confident, competent self. They are sort of broken down, and just the shell kind of is intact, and inside they start feeling a little empty and hollow. They might even start feeling lack of feeling, not feeling enough for people around them, for the feelings, for the family. So let's look at, so this was sort of describing different kind of violence and abuse that can happen. Of course, it can take other shapes as well. And, financial abuse is also very common, where even if the one, both partners are earning, one person would manage the finances and control where the expenditure ought to be, and not allow the other person to be able to spend freely. I recall an instance when in a fairly well-to-do family, the wife did not even have enough money for taking a bus or to come to the clinic to see me, and did not have money for the copay to see me, and that was the reason that she couldn't come often enough. So this kind of keeping complete control of the finances is also an abusive behavior. Let's now look at what happens exactly in the, what is it? Is it always bad? Is the person constantly yelling and being abusive, or is there some pattern? So let's look at the pattern. So they have talked about what is called the cycle of abuse. So in this cycle, a certain pattern progresses. So the first stage, the first phase is that of tension building. Little by little, some comments might be said here and there, and a tension starts building, and whoever is the victim in this dynamic starts feeling that something is about to happen. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling. It's a feeling full of fear. It's a stage when the person is walking on eggshells. And then the second stage is the event itself. The event may be the physical violence. The event might be a stonewalling or shouting. The event might be starting of a silent treatment. So it's the main event then that happens. Then, of course, another thing that goes on is a very important phase that comes on after this. And this is the period of the reconciliation. It's also called the honeymoon period because it's very pleasurable for both persons. There is apologizing, making up, gifts, going out, sense of togetherness, sense of deep conversation, connection. I'll never do this again. You know how much I love you, and so on. So this phase feels so pleasurable to both persons. Even the perpetrator, enjoys this, but it also is very pleasurable for the victim. So here is the finally the relationship that they always hoped and wanted. That this stage can actually set this make things very complicated and confusing for the victim. It can create an addictive pattern, an addiction to this kind of a pattern in the relationship, and an addiction to the relationship itself. It creates what we call a trauma bond. I'm going to bring that up again in just a bit. The final stage, of course, then is of some calm. So we have these 4 stages. There's the tension building, there's the eruption of aggression, violence. There is the honeymoon period, and then there is a period of calm. Sometimes the patterns may, sort of flip-flop, but by and large, this is what's happening. Let's look at some of the the reasons. I mean, very often people who have not experienced an abusive relationship close hand or not seen it in their family and friends will say, well, why doesn't she or he? But very often, it's she, because it's been recorded that 80% of the perpetrators are men. So why doesn't she leave? And even for the victim, there is constantly this question: should I stay? Should I leave? Should I stay? Should I leave? And they go through this analysis constantly in their head. That's where their mind space is. And it's complicated, largely by that trauma bond that has been created. If a person is consistently, quote unquote, bad, it is much easier to leave. But if there are periods of good days, so to speak, it makes the relationship sort of addictive and very hard. There is a bond established with the perpetrator, a trauma bond over a period of time, which becomes very difficult to break. So that's one of the reasons why the victim finds it hard to leave. And of course, in a Desi culture, marriage is, sanctified so much, and that and divorce is such a divorce or being widowed is such a taboo that that of course is also the reason why people, particularly women, will stay in the relationship, will stay in the marriage where there might be abuse, because they feel a sense of shame if they were to decide to leave. So the cultural ramifications, the shame, the trauma bond. Then there is this ostracization that they feel by their very close people, the isolation. I mean, if there is isolation when by the perpetrator in the relationship as a form of emotional abuse, there is even more isolation when the person, particularly the woman, does actually leave the marriage. The family, including the parents, sometimes they are not accepting of it. And if the family is, more open-minded and more accepting these days, the friends around are not. Apart from the fact that the friends get divided, a lot of the woman's friends, including girlfriends, will tend to distance them. This is what I have noticed in my clinic. I'm not quoting any studies here, but this is what I have noticed again and again, that the women will distance themselves from the victim. At times, so they won't invite them to get-togethers and parties in the manner they invited them earlier. At times, they are afraid that, perhaps some kind of a liaison might get, or a connection might get established between this now single person, divorced person, and their own husbands, if there is some concern that they have there, because I have definitely had women share that with me. Then, but more often than that, what I think is happening is that women are afraid that it's going to puncture their own denial. If they might have some concerns and issues in their relationship that they're choosing to not look at, and associating themselves with someone who has already gone through, separation from their marital partner, is going to, in some ways, force them to address some of their own issues, which they don't want to. There is denial. They don't want that denial to be punctured, and they distance themselves. So the victim then finds herself isolated anyhow, right? And of course, there is this, in our Desi culture, we do have this idea that, if you love the person enough, if you care for them enough, that you can actually transform them. Maybe in the beginning, if the relationship has some turbulence and you try to work it out, possibly. However, if this turbulence continues and this pattern continues well into a couple of years or more, chances are it's not going to change. The form of abuse, the nature of abuse might change. They might not physically hit, but then they'll start yelling, or they'll yell a little less, and then it'll become silent treatment. But the breaking down of your spirit and soul still remains. So that pattern of abuse still continues. So, so that's something to keep in mind for those who are using hope as a strategy, hope and love as a strategy, because hope and love, unfortunately, are not enough and don't work out. Another thing that I wanted to say, there's just so much one can talk about, and every time I talk about domestic violence and abuse, and when I leave that conversation, I remember, I should have said this, I should have said that, However, one thing I want to say towards the end is that very often when this happens, people have this idea, it takes two to tango. And, people who are in, outsiders who are looking at this situation where there has been abuse, or where they have heard about abuse having happened, will say that, well, it takes two to clap, for people to clap hands, and it takes two to tango. And I really want to say that that is so unfair. That is so very unfair, because in many, many cases, while once in a while it might be that both people are perpetrators, but in many, many cases, it's one person who is more dominant and aggressive and abusive, and the other person is on the receiving end of a lot of hostility and aggression and victimization and breaking of her spirit, her or his spirit, And it is so, I think when people say two takes two to tango, that they are victimizing the victim even more. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I think with that message, I'm going to stop here. And of course, if anyone is going through any kind of an abuse, or if people come across someone, the best thing to do is to refer them to a therapist or a counselor, or in California, we have SAVE, Shelter Against Violent Environment. We have Maitri, we have Narika. These organizations can be Googled. They have people there, counselors there, that speak different languages. And they are very helpful, far more helpful than maybe talking to, I'm not saying don't talk to your friends, but reaching out to these organizations is going to be more helpful, because they understand what's going on, and they're able to help in manners that maybe others cannot. They can, when it comes to legal support, or getting a safe place, or ensuring their physical safety, or taking care of certain things for which they might not have finances available, that these organizations can facilitate with some of that. So please do reach out to them. They are the best places to go to if you or anybody else that you encounter is experiencing any kind of abuse, whether it is physical or financial or emotional. The other thing I want to just mention here is that therapists and counselors are not mandated reporters. So, however, physicians in private practice and in emergency room are, when they encounter anyone who has been hurt physically. Of course, with emotional abuse, it is really such a range, it's hard to make an assessment. But if a physician will see an injury, then they're mandated to report. Therapists and counselors are not mandated to report. However, it's good to get the help anyhow. All right. Okay, I'll say bye for now, and maybe come up with other concerns related to emotional well-being in another video. Bye.